Hi, welcome to the review of the day, which is for The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. So this is a 1957 novel, but I feel it's a very contemporary novel in a lot of ways, and for me it's a reread. I've been rereading this book since I was a teenager, and I rifled through my parents' bookshelves, and John Wyndham was one who was prominent there, so I read this but I'd read it the first time by the time I was 13. And I've been rereading it and rereading it ever since, so that's decades now. Now, this is in fact the exact same copy that I have been rereading for decades. There's a nice little Ballantine book that belonged to my parents, and it is from 1957. Apparently, the first Ballantine book. Interestingly enough, I've just realised that my edition says copyright 1957 by John Benyon Harris, which was part of John Wyndham's name. John Wyndham was actually John Wyndham Parks Lucas Benyon Harris, and he did write as John Benyon. I didn't know he'd written as John Benyon Harris. Anyhow, all this aside, I'm very fond of this edition. It's not a first edition, and I know it's a little bit creepy, but I've always loved this blue baby with the golden eyes over the little Tudor English village. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It was never my favourite John Wyndham, but I've found that as I've grown older, I've grown into it more and more. All the things that I didn't love about it so much in my teens, I'm enjoying more and more every time I read it. And I hadn't planned to reread it just yet. I think I reread it a couple of years ago. But I happened to be over at Liminal Spaces watching Chris discover John Wyndham for the first time, which is exciting, and I'm quite jealous of him. You find Wyndham for the first time, it's got to be exciting. And listen, watching his two very good reviews, he's got, I'll post a link to the one I remember seeing recently down below. He's got a non-spoiler and a deep dive, which is a bit spoilery. So, having watched him, I just had to reread it. And I have. And it was great. And I enjoyed it as much this time as all the other times. So, my Ballantine edition describes it as a spell-binding chiller. I've never heard a book described as a chiller recently, but okay. Chilling, yes. I would agree. As well as being a science fiction book, pure classic science fiction, it says so here on the cover, it is a beautifully written novel. It's got that English understated vocabulary and subtlety of writing that makes English novels so enjoyable, and in a strange sort of way polite while they're doing horrible things. And I would say that in its own way, this is very much an early polite English horror type book. It's a slow creeper, but there's an element of horror to everything that happens within it. So Wyndham's writing has always fascinated me. It's just beautiful writing, and he has immaculate world building. And he's got a great way of hooking you. So the first paragraph in this book, part 1, no entry to Midwich. One of the luckiest accidents in my wife's life is that she happened to marry a man who was born on the 26th of September. But for that, we should both of us undoubtedly have been home in Midwich on the night of the 26th to the 27th, with consequences which I have never ceased to be thankful she was spared. And that sets you up. It sets you up for the writing. It sets you up for the scenario. It is just beautiful writing. And here's some more. This one's from page 11. During the day of the 26th of September, there seems to have been no trace of a foreshadow. Possibly Mrs. Brandt, the blacksmith's wife, did feel a slight uneasiness at the sight of 9 magpies in one field, as she afterwards claimed. And Miss Ogle, the postmistress, might have been perturbed on the previous night by a dream of singularly large vampire bats. But if so, it is unfortunate that Mrs. Brandt's omens and Miss Ogle's dreams should have been so frequent as to nullify the alarm value. Again, beautiful writing, beautiful characterization. With those few words, he creates two characters, one of which appears later in the book, second one not so much, but with just a quirk of the writing, he has done so much, and I've got to appreciate that a great deal. And even though his writing has always seemed to me to be beautiful and I've always appreciated it, I don't think as a child I really understood how humorous it is. This book has a lot of humor in it. It's got horror, it's got weirdness, it's got science fiction, it's got some really deep philosophical concepts that he plays with later. But there are levels of humor to it as well, and I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 4, page 23 to 24 in my edition. Major Dramley. So, this will be spoilers. So, the first two chapters we've been introduced to our main narrator, or at least, he's not so much the protagonist, he very much is the narrator. And him and his wife are trying to get back to Midwich, and they find this huge dome over the village, and they can't get in. And then we sort of backtrack in the story to how people first discovered that that dome was over there. And one of the people who discovered it was Major Dramley. Major Dramley was surprised into the use of an expression more common in his youth. "By Jove," he said with concern. "By Jove!" He stepped clear of the stile onto the road and began to hurry toward the entangled vehicles. Then, as he drew closer, something prompted him to stop short. "Had a feeling there was something deuced odd," he explained later to me. "Old campaigner, you know, get a sense when things are a bit off colour. Learn not to ignore it." Yeah, man. He's walking on a quiet country road where he walks every day, and he's in a pile-up of some 7 vehicles, including a man lying supine in the field. And something odd? You don't need to be an old campaigner for that. And the way it's phrased just struck me this time with the sense of humour that it never has before. So the way this builds up is understated in the way that John Wyndham's writing often is. So you've got Midwich, it's been surrounded by this invisible sphere, and by the time that happens, we've already been introduced to a few of it. The characters, anyone who steps across an invisible line is instantly knocked out, but the second that they're pulled back over the line, they just sit right up, whether they're canary or human, with no ill effects. And our narrator is brought into this affair in a bleak way, because while his wife and he are staying in the local town, unable to go home, though we first see this sphere as Richard's wife. What is her name? I've forgotten what her name is. Richard's wife. They trying to go across the road to drive home. They're stopped by a soldier. They realise there's no point in arguing with him. He's just obeying his orders. They head back. Then they head across the fields, and they decide to make a run for it across the fields for the home. She's a little bit ahead of him. She falls down dead. He continues to run for her, also falls down dead. Both of them are later pulled back out of the influence of the sphere. So by now we've been introduced to all this. They're fine. They go back to the town. They're staying in the local pub. And Richard Gayford runs into someone that he knew from the army. Now Richard has left the army and he's now a writer, but his old mate Bernard, second name temporarily forgotten, has stayed in the army and has gone into one of those secretive branches. Wyndham never tells us which branch, but it's obviously something to do with intelligence and weird stuff. Weird stuff. And so that's how Richard and his wife end up being asked by Bernard if they will keep an eye out for oddities in the village. And oddities, the village has moved on. Everyone's woken up. A few people did die during the event. One from hypothermia because they collapsed outside. Another whole family burnt to death when their house caught fire. And some of the pile-ups on the road trying to get in were fire wagons trying to reach them, only they couldn't. So The village wakes up, everything seems back to normal, there's nothing they can do about it, and there's nothing really to say. They start calling it the day out. But Bernard from whichever branch of the UK intelligence has decided something weird has happened and we need to keep an eye on it. He says, I could post an intelligence officer here if I had the budget for one full-time intelligence officer here, but they would be outside the village customs, and Richard and his wife have already lived there for a year. So they agree to keep an eye out. Though initially they're a bit huffy about that. They feel like they're being asked to spy on their neighbours. But eventually they agree to look out for oddities, and oddities soon emerge. Now, this is where the narration ceases to be the personal experience per se of Richard, at least sequentially. And it's explained by John Wyndham from Richard's point of view about why that should be. Because a lot of the things that he finds out later or through second hand, and instead Wyndham compiles it into a sequential narrative of all the things as they pile up. So the first strange incident occurred around pregnancies. And here we have a completely genius look into the 1950s social attitudes as described and narrated by someone who I feel must have been very much ahead of his time. Because a lot of 50s writers could have written this sequence in many different ways that would have dated it and made it feel awkward and made the modern reader go ick. Because in the 50s, unmarried women getting pregnant was still against societal norms. And the fact is that pretty much there's an interesting little discussion between the doctor and the pastor, reverend, churchman, whatever they're called. I've forgotten what it's called. I think it's an Anglican. I've never really understood Anglicans terribly well. Anyway, there's a discussion between them about this social problem that's brewing in the village, and they accept that it's about the pregnancy. So on the one hand, the churchman has got the problem is he's got these people with these women coming to him in despair saying it couldn't happen, and he said, well, if some people could come to me and say that and I just wouldn't believe them, but these are young women that I've known their whole lives, and they're intelligent and they're educated, and they're saying nothing has happened that could cause this. And at the same time, you've got the doctor who's been getting similar and slightly different narratives, and they both urgently agree that something has to be done. Now, at one point, the reverend pastor, probably a pastor, turns to the doctor and says, how many do you think it's occurred to? And the pastor says, well, I think just slightly over 60. And the doctor says, I think just slightly over 60 women. And the pastor goes, well, that's a very specific number. It's like, why did you choose just over 60 rather than 20 or 50? And the doctor goes, well, I estimate that there's just over 60 women of approximately childbearing age in the Midwich area, and I think every single one's pregnant. And the Reverend is kind of horrified, but it turns out that is very much the case, with one or two exceptions that Wyndham never really bothers to explain. A couple of them he explains, a couple of them aren't really ever explained. But so the doctor's called away from this little meeting by a boy who comes to says that his sister's been taken poorly. His young sister, a young woman who is very single, has just drunk half a bottle of disinfectant. And the doctor very much suspects that there's other women who are starting to do things as desperate to themselves. So you've got this social situation in the 50s where probably a lot of women would have reacted like that. And Wyndham manages to tell all this with no judgment. And we don't actually get the feeling that he's judgy about any of these affairs. The doctor and the reverend get together and they put together a community meeting to try and bring a sort of social acceptance and recognition that this is something that's happening to everyone, to try to create a common spirit between all the women in the village. And for that, one of our other main narrators is brought in. This is Mrs. Zellaby. Gordon Zellaby becomes a very major character. He is a author, Wyndham seems to like his authors. He's an older man. He's described as having white hair, and his third wife is fairly younger than him. And she is one of the ones who has become pregnant at the same time as her daughter-in-law, who's just about to get married, and it's a mess. But she's described as a level-headed woman, and she's brought into the affair and is very much contributes to non-panic. And then the babies are born. So the babies are all born in the village. Again, there are indeed about 60 of them. About half of them are boys and about half of them are girls. They all have the characteristic golden eyes. And once they're born, the oddities start mounting up. Fairly early on, it's clear that these babies can control their mothers and other adults. And as they grow older, it becomes more and more of a problem, and the village becomes more and more under the pump. Now, because they grow at a faster rate, it takes a while. It doesn't take as long as this book would take in terms of book time for us to reach the point. Now, our narrator, Richard, and his wife actually leave the village after they've been there for a couple of years. At the age of 2, all the Midwich babies, who are the golden-eyed cuckoo babies, are about double their development that you'd expect for their age. But then Richard and his wife are away for a number of years. They come back when the babies are 9, but they present as 16-year-olds, both intelligence and everything else. And that's where Richard learns that Zellaby, who has been one of their early teachers and been fascinated by them all along the way, believes and claims that there are essentially, rather than about 60 of them, 2. 1 girl, 1 boy. And while there's a whole heap of different individuals, and they will occasionally lay claim to the names that they were given by their foster mothers or foster parents, they essentially, if you teach something to 1 baby, then all the babies of that gender will immediately know it. So you have to teach anything twice, 1 to a girl, 1 to a boy, but then all the Midwich babies know it. And that's when we start to, this later period of the book is when we start to progress to the fact that these are obviously aliens, and they're obviously antagonistic to humans, and some bad stuff starts to happen. A human kills a Midwich baby, they kill him back. They basically force him to kill himself. Bad things start rolling, and I'm not going to spoil other end. It's probably not much of a spoiler because this has been reworked into a number of movies, most of which I'm sure fail to represent how good this book is, because this book is marvelous in every regard. This is a book that I stayed up reading at night until I could feel my eyes closing on their own, because I was enjoying it so much that I wanted to keep going. And that is pretty much Wyndham for me every single time. Now, I did know there's something interesting that I have noticed about the Midwich Cuckoos, and I noticed it in Chris's review as well as in a couple of online reviews that I glanced at before sitting down to do this video. Every single person who reads it seems to have a slightly different take-home message, and they say slightly different things about it. So take all my views with a grain of salt, because when you read it, and if you've never read it, you absolutely should go out and do that soon, everyone takes away something different. So let's look at the Wikipedia review. It tells the tale of an English village in which the women become pregnant by brood parasitic aliens. Good on you, Wikipedia. I love you. But you're wrong. We don't know they're brood parasitic aliens. We never actually know what these aliens are, where they come from. What their goals are is spelled out to us by the children eventually, in that they want to dominate the Earth. They want to become the dominant intelligent species on Earth. And that's a goal. At one point, Zellaby and Richard are throwing around the notion of, if you're going to invade Earth, are you going to do it in a big and spectacular way, like, and H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds is mentioned. That's basically the same sort of invasion that you'd expect to see from a human. They've got more evolved weapons, but they're essentially doing the things that the way a human would do. And Zellaby puts forth the notion that wouldn't it be easier to send in a 5th column full of babies that are essentially in appearance human, and that nullifies the ability to act against them. Is if they were an obvious invader, it gives them a place of refuge, because many of them have mothers that still adore them and would give them information if they needed it. There's a whole host of protections and qualifications that make it a much more subtle invasion than something like The War of the Worlds or similar books. Brood parasitic aliens. Well, they are called the Midwich Cuckoos because early on it suggested that they were implanted in the woman in some way. But as for parasitic, no, they're not really parasitic. By the actual definition of what a parasite is, it's a good concept, but parasitism tends to be a strategy host which disadvantages the young of the species that being parasitized. In brood parasitism and parasitic infections tend to have a negative reaction to the host, a negative reaction on the part of the host. Whereas for the Midwich Cuckoos, it's an invasion. They just happen to have gone a very subtle way about it. Anyway, I think this is a fabulous book. I thoroughly enjoy it every time I read it. I'm glad to have reread it. It was as good as I remembered and better every single time. Thank you for watching this rather rambling video. I haven't disclosed the whole of the plot, but if you want to, I'm sure there's plenty of sites out there that will give you the whole caboodle. And in actual fact, even if you knew every single thing that happened in that book, it wouldn't be the same as actually reading it, because the enjoyment of the reading itself is what makes all the John Wyndham books such excellent rereads. It doesn't matter if you know what's going to happen. It doesn't really matter if you're word perfect on a conversation. You're still going to enjoy the process. So, thank you for watching. Have a great day. Read good books. John Wyndham, definitely good books if you've never read them. And we're coming up on Christmas. So have a great festive season of whatever type of festivities you choose to indulge in. Bye.